Good morning and welcome back to Sundays at 10 a.m. I'm your host, Stephen Russell from Cape Cod, right here, and we're so glad you could join us here this morning. I'd like to talk to you about something that we've all experienced at some time or other within our lives. Have you ever faced the sting of indifference? Here you were having a great need within your particular life and people just did not care at all. And there you were carrying this burden, struggling through a situation, whatever the case might be, and no one seemed interested. Indifference. I like to call it the sin of indifference because a very famous person called it that at a speech he gave. We'll refer to that in a few minutes' time. Let's just first of all establish right off the bat that every single one of us have been indifferent at times. Just too busy, running around, doing this, doing that. We just had no time to stop. And so we became indifferent to people around us, whatever their particular situation might have been. The dictionary describes indifference as the quality, state, or fact of being indifferent towards, a lack of concern, interest, or feeling towards another, a lack of importance, meaning, or worth offered another. That's indifference. Quite simple in its description, and I have fallen into the trap of being indifferent towards others many times in my life, and I have a suspicion I'm not the only one that falls into that category. Here's the person I mentioned to you a little bit earlier on, Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Prize recipient Elie Wiesel delivered a speech on the 12th of April 1999 at the White House as part of the Millennium Lecture Series. And he said in part, I'm going to quote him for you, he said, "Of course, indifference can be tempting, seductive. It is easier to look away. It is so much easier to avoid such rude interruptions to our work, our dreams, our hopes. It is, after all, awkward, troublesome, to be involved in another person's despair. Yet, for the person who is indifferent, his or her neighbor are of no consequence, and therefore their lives are meaningless. Their anguish is of no interest. Indifference reduces the other to abstraction." He went on to say in this very famous speech that you can Google, indifference is not a beginning, it is an end. And therefore, indifference is always the friend of the enemy, for it benefits the aggressor, never his victim, whose pain is magnified when he or she feels forgotten. The political prisoner in his cell, the hungry children, the homeless refugees, not to respond to their plight, not to relieve their solitude by offering them a spark of hope, is to exile them from human memory. And in denying their humanity, we betray our own. Indifference, he went on to say, is not only a sin, it is a punishment. And this is one of the most important lessons of this outgoing century's wide-ranging experiments in good and evil. He, of course, Elie Wiesel, was referring to the time that he himself was imprisoned in Nazi Germany. And he felt abandoned and alone when they questioned amongst themselves as prisoners, surely the Allied forces must know what's going on behind the doors. Surely they must see the starving and the tragic events that are unfolding before our very own eyes in these prison camps. Surely the torturing and all of that and the gassing of human beings must be known. He challenged in that speech America when he said oil was being sold to the Germans. Very, very challenging indeed. As we listened to what Elie Wiesel had said, a question raised up in my mind as I sat watching this, because I'm now in 2022. I'm now in modern day times where such things wouldn't take place. Yet they do. We look at the Russian-Ukraine conflict going on. As I watch the news, both local and both internationally as well. I see several things that come to mind when I look at the subject of being indifferent. Am I more passionate about the cause itself or the people affected by that cause? Am I more interested in flying that flag and shouting through that megaphone in that particular way of doing things, or the people that are affected by the very cause I'm fighting for? Because I'm interested in the person who's having to run 3 jobs to try and feed her children. I'm interested in the person that finds that they're just unable to pay their rent. They just have no more money left because they've stretched to the ultimate limit. And yet the ones that are fighting for them in the cause live in mansions with all kinds of luxuries. I once had this argument with an aid organization, quite a well-known aid organization, and they wanted to stage a photo op so that they could raise more money. I refused to get involved whilst they carried empty boxes to an airplane with the caption underneath the photograph, "Your much needed aid on its way to the needy." They weren't interested, really interested in the plight of those hungry people. But the large percentage skimmed off the top to run the administrative and exorbitant salaries of the executives that lived in posh houses and drove fancy cars. I think that's a pattern that repeats itself many times over when the press catch those who are shouting for the cause but live behind mansions and big walls surrounding their gardens so no one can come near them. So I'm not interested in those big issues. I really am interested in you and I having a conversation about this, because I think we can do something about this. I think it's quite simple for us to make a few decisions. What's the antidote towards being indifferent? Because all of us are guilty of indifference at some time or other. Let's make it real practical. Indifferent towards family members. Maybe a neighbor down the road we know has got some problems and we just don't have the time to get involved. Or it could be a colleague at work that we know is undergoing suffering. They lost a loved one and we just don't want to get involved. It's too embarrassing and maybe just too much time going to be taken up. How about just being self-absorbed and we're so busy with our own lives we just don't have time for anyone else, as I said. You know, God wasn't indifferent toward us. In fact, in the first book of John, chapter 4, he tells us we love because he first loved us. In the early Christian world, as the early church started off way back 2,000 years ago, they were known amongst the Greco-Roman world of the day that there were a people that would go and bury the dead that died along the way and had no one to bury them. The Christians would go and bury them, and they were often mocked and laughed at. They would adopt abandoned children, on and on and on. This is because God is interested and he works within us to feel the plight of people around us. Love becomes the point of action. Not because I'm angry about some cause I believe is unfair, that will rob me of some future or some standing or some status. Causes, whether climate issues, gender issues, race issues, or any other issues as important as they are, don't solve the plight often of the people that are disenfranchised by that cause. It merely adds fuel to the fight. Indifference is also not apathy. Apathy is just not feeling anything for anyone, a deadness. Indifference knows what is right, but ignores the consequences of those caught in the crisis. One chooses to be indifferent. I think when you stand up and you make some kind of a speech, and then you drive home in your luxury car and the gates close automatically behind you into a world of luxury and comfort, and all of those who are still out there suffering, starving, struggling, battling, that's not, I think, an answer at all. It just adds fuel to the fire. So, in making this practical for you and I. How can I be involved in being different and not indifferent? Here are some contours to, I think, combating that indifference. You see, we're called to make a difference. That's within our power as human beings. Just by simply doing a few simple things can change the life of someone in your world. So what would be some of those contours? I think first of all, number one, ascertain. They're all with the letter A. They start with the letter A, and there are three of them. And so the first one is ascertain. Ascertain where your indifference comes from. You see, it's an internal decision. Often it's based on culture. I just grew up not really aware of people's problems. Or I've just learned to shut myself off and not get involved. There are numbers of reasons why people are indifferent, and I can't list them all here. But the Bible talks about people having what is called a heart of stone, meaning that the person has, as the Bible says, hardened their heart towards doing the right thing. And you know, it starts with you making the right choice about people and their plight. And that is within your and my power to do. All of us have the power to do the right thing, to say the right thing. Sometimes it's as simple as reaching across the table at work and offering a word of comfort to someone, affirmation of that they're doing okay. We all need that. That, to me, is the practical side of not being indifferent. It's not some huge, great, big, massive project we take on to save the world. No, I think it just starts with how do you treat your neighbor? I think it starts with how do you treat your family and the people at work? That, to me, is where not being indifferent comes to play. Number two, accept. Accept that following indifference means someone, somewhere, will face the consequences of your and my indifference. In other words, put a face to your attitude. Think about someone right now that you've just simply ignored, haven't had time for. You're too busy. Your life is full. When you see that person's face and you realize as you measure your attitude towards that person, you realize that indifference has a face. And that is to say, just as that speech in the White House showed us, indifference causes pain and suffering. There is a photo that has now become a worldwide viral hit on social media, and you can Google it and you'll find it. And news outlets showed of this police officer in Argentina performed what they called a gesture of love after she heard a crying baby that needed to be fed. What had happened was several children were brought into the local hospital and they were found in a bad state of affair. They were malnourished, they were hungry, they were scared, they were afraid, and amongst them was this malnourished baby. Officer Celeste Ayala didn't even think twice. On duty and in her police uniform, breastfed this malnourished infant. A moment that was captured in a photo that went viral across the social media. There was such response, such reaction to a simple act of love toward another human being. She didn't know the baby. She didn't know the family. She could have made all kinds of reasons why she's busy as a police officer. She has a job to be done. She doesn't have time for this. All kinds of good and great excuses. But she wasn't prepared to be indifferent. That's a decision she made there and then. Her perspective was she could not simply ignore the need of that fellow human being, that fellow baby. Then I think number three, to me, would be action. Start where you are and look to make a difference in somebody's life today. It's within your hands to do. And you know, of course, the Bible shows us this pattern. Jesus said, love one another just as I've loved you. He told that in the Gospel of John. What does he mean by that? Well, we know that Jesus was willing to serve, lay down his life, reach out to the unreachable, reach out to those that society had shunned and pushed away. And that's why sometimes, and forgive me, I'm so jaded towards politicians when I see that they're there to cheer the poor person who is struggling in a neighborhood that's fallen apart, and to stand on their behalf, and then disappear into the luxury behind the iron gates with guards standing outside in some luxury part of town. Perhaps no one will ever know what you do. No one will ever see what you're doing to help that fellow man. You might not end up on social media. You might not end up on the front page of some newspaper as a hero somewhere. But just because you've been indifferent to people's needs around you doesn't mean you cannot start today. You see, we all have that capacity to make a change through a simple decision we take right now, right here. Who is that family member you've simply walked away from? You're indifferent towards their suffering and their struggling. Maybe they are where they are because of family members that treated them that way. How about the person at work? What about the neighbor, the person down the road, the single mom in your area that battles to run 2 jobs while she's trying to struggle with her children? Oh, listen, people, there are all kinds of places and reasons and things that we don't have to be indifferent towards. It just simply starts with us making simple decisions to show affirmation, compassion, love towards someone, helping someone in simple acts of love. Usually the small gestures that count in the big moments, just like the police officer's response to the starving baby, are the things that change the lives of people. I wonder how many of us remember seeing photographs of firemen that saved babies, and then some 18 years later, there they go and find the very fireman that saved them. And I'll take a photograph with them and say, I graduated out of college and you saved my life when I was a baby. When you saved my life when I was a toddler, here I am. I've graduated from college and I want to come and say thank you. Those are all moving photographs. We don't get to often see enough of those photographs, but you are that person that can make the difference in someone else's life. Action also, I think, keeps you wide awake to not being lulled into indifference. Like exercise, it takes practice to keep yourself not being simply a bystander when action is really required. We've all seen the photos on social media platforms where someone was in an accident and bystanders jump in and they drag the person out of the burning vehicle and save them and help the injured along the side of the road. And not a few feet away, others stood by and ignored the entire situation and looked the other way. We're not those that look the other way. We're those that say, how can I help? How can I roll up my sleeves and get involved with my neighbor or my family member or a colleague or whatever the case might be? Don't be indifferent. Take up the challenge and show that you care about people. That's what's important. So ascertain, accept, action. 3 simple things that all lead to changing the present condition to a better way for everyone. Thank you for joining me today here, and I pray that you have a great week, that you find the opportunity to show a difference to someone who's only experienced indifference at this stage. God bless you. We'll see you next Sunday.